Today's video comes from a Q&A portion of a recent IPSA professional training seminar between Steve Richards, the course director, and Nick Iafrati, one of our students. Nick asked several nested questions around, broadly, the Platonic form of the feminine and the nature of libido, drawing on both Freud and Jung. Steve gives several in-depth answers based in his 40 years of clinical empiricism, of working with real-life men and women. There are no sound bites in this video. It's highly nuanced, and we recommend using it for deep study to either complement your clinical practice or to inform your own personal myth work for self-development. If you'd like to be in a seminar just like this one, training to be a hypnotherapist and psychotherapist under Steve and Pauline Richards in psychosystems analysis, then we invite you to check out the link to our course website in the description below. Our next intake begins in early 2022, so please let us know if you plan to apply by emailing contact@jungtoliveby.com. We hope you enjoy.
I think at one point, I think you've said it, which is that sex or the lust drive, the lust instinct can be almost like a messenger instinct for other types of interaction.
Yeah.
So potentially for a man, having that internal imago as the feminine, that is, okay, men have to go out and literally engage in order to find this, right? This virtual image, but the other experiences will coalesce around it and almost create this like, just go up and through. So that was one thing, because I feel like if Jung had just concentrated on what was going through him through a Freudian lens, he would have figured himself out, or in a way gotten a new resolution.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. To go back to what you said at the beginning about sex, that's really libido, isn't it? In the sense of, is libido all sexual or not? And that was one of the separations between Freud and Jung. Freud saw it apparently as being primarily that, but modifiable into just about anything. And I think from within his framework, that made a lot of sense, because way back in an evolutionary sense, the only purpose of life at a microbial level is to reproduce. That's it. They're there to reproduce. So the so-called sex drive, if you like, for a microbe is primary. And bearing in mind, everything builds upon everything else in an evolutionary sense, that will just stay there. So in humans, it's there and it pushes, but the capacity to modify that is vast. And for Freud, we can mismodify it and become neurotic. But for Jung, we can turn it into anything, almost at will, certainly by consciously directed self-analysis, and then even elevate it into a religious role, which I think is where he began to lose it. Personally, particularly with Christianity, which is religion without the passion going into sexuality. I know it does when it's corrupted. That's when you see Adler creeping through with holding hands with Freud. And we have a Jungian problem with Christianity when it goes wrong because it's been elevated. But there are other religions, and there always have been, that utilize passion and sexuality on its own, for its own sake, incorporated within the belief system, and that elevates practices and allows things to be done properly because it's earthed. The sexual side of libido is earthed. Where it's not earthed, you tend to get paedophilia and things like that coming through, which we know happens, unfortunately. So yeah, it just struck me when you were saying that about the definition of libido in that sense, and what things can or can't be. But yeah, to go back to archetype, I don't think they're necessary at all. We're mistaking representation of something for being the thing in and of itself, which is an error for Jung, error 101.
The libido, let's say the libido energy one experiences that is in direct relation to a certain type of projection, right? Let's say a sexual projection, right? Is and could be indicative of yes, engagement in terms of sex, or could it be engagement in terms of more of a, I don't want to say a sublimation, but more of just general life engagement?
Yes, and this is why we say mate and relate, because relate is so broad. And I know it kind of rhymes, mate and relate, and it seems convenient, but I do think it works. The microbial level, mate,
Yeah.
and then with more and more complexity thereafter, relate becomes important. And when we have a brain like we have, as a human species, relating internally is possible in a way that other animals and creatures probably can't do. They're more impelled and less reflexive. So
Right.
by the time we're human, mate and relate is primary. We can't get rid of mate, it pushes. And relate is inevitable because we don't survive if we don't relate. So put both of them together and you have a relating function, which is an anticipation that we should do that. Therefore, it's instinctive. And there is an image of that which encapsulates everything. And it tends to be, for men, to be feminine for mating purposes, but relating purposes too, because of that initial relationship to our mothers as caregivers. And then you find actually there's a qualitative difference with a lot of men compared to a lot of women about how romantic they are and how they romanticize relationships. I know that that's a broad brush statement, but you'll find evidence of it even in academic psychology journals that men often are far more romantic in that sense than women. So in that sense, there is something which impels a man towards romantic attachment towards women. And that could be probably distilled down to the necessity to build social relationships and structures so we don't go around murdering and raping women. You know, the mating side of it is properly contained, and there's so much complexity within it.
And at the same time, it might be indicative of ancestral memory in a way, right?
Yeah.
In terms of what those images might look like, or the idea of those images looks like for certain individuals, right?
Yeah, I think that's the case. And whereas I can't follow Rupert Sheldrake personally on everything he talks about, I do think he has insights which are the best explanation for observations that we may make. And this idea about habits being formed and families having a collective field which is inherited somehow independent of their biology. I would prefer to think of them as being co-present and interactive in a causal way. You require both. That would explain why anima types appear to be passed down independently of learning, which immediately suggests they're inherited. But what's the mechanism of inheritance? It may be a field phenomenon, it may be genetic, it may be a combination of both, or some other factor we just don't know about at the moment. But it seems to be the case.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you.
One thing I found out about working with men on the Platonic form of the feminine is that it is interesting because there is a ground state, there is a baseline for it, which is not particularly attractive. It's virtual, it's almost plain. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense of being plain. I mean it in the way that Plato himself understood it, which is that, in his words, you should be able to find the Platonic form of love in the beloved that you are with.
Yep.
Because she is an instantiation of that and of the variation that's represented by the transcendent whole. So there are many, many ways of being beautiful, if you like, in that sense. And the difference, but somehow they're the same because of the quality of beauty that we perceive in that person. And then when we're in a loving romantic relationship, we access the form. This is what he said: through the person of the individual that we love, we access the transcendent whole. That I think is his way of intuiting and understanding and communicating the idea of that prepared template. But you'll often find men who are drawn almost inexplicably to relatively, they would judge unattractive women because they are close to something which is somehow representing everything and is unrefined, is not distilled, it's a baseline. And that's a really, that's not strange, it's an interesting place to go if you work with men in depth about this, how that can be. And it's like she's all women and no women, and she's not even pretty, but somehow she is, and I can't figure out what it means. And then you work on it, you get deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and suddenly, whoa. And then when you work with them, you say, well, that's a pretty girl, that's a beautiful girl. And none of them look like this plain girl, but none of them look like each other either. And I'm really confused by that. And I said, well, you're only confused if you use your conscious mind to make separations, if you make discriminations like they were chunks of information, Miller number phenomenon perhaps. But if you use affect and then the Platonic dialectic to access the form, it will all make sense. And then we're really in Platonic territory then, and we understand what he meant and the profundity of that, that, you know, any woman that you can actually love will reflect all women. But some women are more distilled and some are less distilled. But the baseline is present.
Well, that must serve biology and reproduction, mustn't it? Because
yeah.
Inevitably there's more choice for both men and women
Yes.
in terms of who they have a relationship with.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree. And you'll get something similar with the animus as well, and the women that I've worked with in depth produce the same kind of thing. And the Jungians tend to split that into four, like of course they would, wouldn't they? A nice neat quaternity of animus types, but really it's not. It's a dynamic bandwidth that's funnel shaped. It's broad on the surface, it's narrow at the bottom. The bit that's narrow at the bottom defines everything that appears on the surface. It gives you the operational parameters, like Pauline said, for biological reproduction. But that appears in consciousness when we're conscious of it as the Platonic form. And then we have an affect connection to the perception of that which is innate. That makes it powerful. And that's the fundamental element behind romantic love. When somebody feels it, is that they feel the totality in the one person that they're in love with at that moment, that they access everything. And that's why it's so overpowering. The genome goes, yeah, that's it, agree, go for that one. That's it, there's enough in there, feel it, go for it, mate and relate.
No, we were talking about, you mentioned Destian, right? And like he talks about the difference between infatuation and love.
Yeah.
Right. Would you say that those two are on a spectrum? It's like one and the same. It's just like, okay, the infatuation, that the genome is like, yes, we got it right here. This is where it goes. But then love being the relating. So mate, relate. Yeah,
I think, thanks for that. That's a really strong question, really, because again, it's going to require quite a bit of distillation even to unpack that. I think there's something in the use of the terms that kind of makes the outcome of that inevitable. So from an Aristotelian perspective, if we accept that as you know, your major premise, then your conclusion necessarily follows. My view is, though, the statement itself might not be adequately resolved, not yours, but if we separate, this is Destian, infatuation from love off as being somehow different, we're missing all of the ground in between, which is dynamic. The thing for me that unifies all of it is not the polarity, it's the unity that underlies the polarity. And then there's the expression of that deep structure that surfaces in what appears to be infatuation by the judgment of a third party, say a therapist, who might say, this is infatuation, it's not real love. Well, how does the therapist know that? And when the person accesses the form and then the distillation of their anima or animus, if we use Jungian terms, they'll understand whether it's infatuation in a reductive sense, or whether it's real love, or whether it's just lust, or wherever it might be. So I guess what I'm saying is it's the reverse of Chomsky's transformational grammar. You know, on the surface, all these different statements that mean the same thing, they mean the same thing, but it's slightly different, and it's in the nuance. But you have to go to that which powers the surface to understand what's appearing on the surface. And that's the way I work with people when you know, it's an anima animus issue in classical Jungian terms. I want to know what's the baseline doing. Where are they in terms of lifespan development? Is it just lust, which is opportunistically attached by the psyche, by the biology of the person, to an infatuation stage? Is it the clock is saying reproduce, and that they feel infatuation outside of the relationship, which is really the drive to reproduce? The Jungian will say, if you won't do it with your partner, do it with that person, do it with any bloody person, just do it. And it comes up that way, and then the person feels infatuated. And then they wake up perhaps and think, what the hell was I doing? And they don't know, because they're not connected to their instincts in a conscious way. They feel the effect, literally feel the affect of the genomic pressure, the instinctive pressure, which manifests as an infatuation, which is a projection, or any of these other alternative languages we might use. But I always say, well, how old is the person? What's the context? What's the relationship? What's the distillation of the type? How did the relationship they're in now grow or not grow? And what's been projected out? And if you look at it in a Destian way, you're into alchemy as a metaphor, which is very entertaining, but it could be dangerous to suggest then that the answer is in an alchemical union with the other person outside of that relationship. I mean, our baseline, Paul and I, when we were working, was always to try to save the relationship. That would be the ground state that we would operate from. Unless we received a clear message, this relationship's over, we would work with the assumption, the saving a relationship, where there was, say, a freeway thing going on with an outside person in that relationship, we'd always work with the assumption that that's where we should go, because that's an established system over time. And if something has gone wrong in the relationship, which means a third party has been brought into it, rather than assume that the third party is the best option, I would rather start with the assumption that the relationship itself is a system that's worthy of attention, and see what distills itself out from that. That usually works. Whereas if I went to the automatic assumption that the new partner, the new potential partner, is the right choice, and it's wrong, so many people get hurt. Sorry if that was too much.
No, that was one heck of an answer for sure. Thank you. No, I think that's just feeling it and knowing it. I mean, like that is one, like you said, the most humanistic way of going about it. But then at the core of it, seeing at the core of what is actually presenting itself and why.
Yeah.
And I think it's unfortunate, because I think the majority, for what I've seen, the majority of other therapists out there will do the opposite, saying like, look at this third option, go for that. Like clearly that's better than, the grass is always greener, right?
Yeah.
But it is extremely destabilizing when that happens. Yeah.
You become an agent then on behalf of the third party, who may not be present, may not have consulted with you. And then I'll use the term for descriptive purposes, not judgmental ones, but the wronged party within the relationship will feel isolated. They're being attacked not only by their partner, but also by the therapeutic process. And that's a terrible situation for a human being to be in, who has been hurt and then is further hurt by the therapists. The truth will out in a Socratic sense. So if they shouldn't be there, it will work out, and the process will work it out. And that's a Socratic dialectic. And the fact that Socrates was so much into sensory delights, you know, he liked his wine, and he liked his food, and he liked his pleasure, but he was also a thinker. He was a thinker who could feel. None of this Jungian typology shit, pardon my language, it didn't split his experience of himself. They didn't think like that. For them, the divine logos was a feeling as well as a thought. It was an affect as well as a cognition. It was a sensory experience. I honestly think they had it just right.
Yeah. Well, because at that point it wasn't an either or. It is.
Yeah. It is. It's dynamic. It's as it unfolds. And this idea that you can start anywhere, including in error, means we don't have to worry about where we're at right now. We just have to have the honest intentionality to get to the right place in the end. And that's an analog for couples therapy. That they come in when they're in strife and distress. Some kind of error has been made, but they might get there in the end if the intentionality to work together is there. But if we split them into opposites, contending opposites, and talk about third factors, transcendent positions, they'll think, well, yeah, my third option is my transcendent position. Bye, I'm off, I'm out of here. Thank you for that. There's so many nuanced suggestions that can be introduced into relationships by therapists because of dogma.